In 1991, to mark the 70th anniversary of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, RTE, the Irish national broadcaster, teamed up with Thames TV in the UK to produce the treaty, a made-for-TV movie that aims to educate a British audience largely ignorant of Irish history and their own country's role in it, and provide a re-evaluation of a fractious moment in time for Irish people. The treaty came about 22 years into the Troubles. In the Republic of Ireland, it premiered in the same year as the 75th anniversary of the 1916 Rising took place. Attitudes in the Republic towards the campaign of the Provisional IRA and Sinn Féin were a lot different to the perception of the old IRA and Sinn Féin of the revolutionary period. Today, we're going to talk about how the discussion of the Troubles, and specifically the Provisional IRA and Sinn Féin, was censored both in Great Britain and the Republic of Ireland, as well as how the Troubles shaped the ways of thinking about Irish history in the Republic, and how both of those things had an influence on the making of the treaty. This video won't focus too much on the Anglo-Irish Treaty negotiations themselves. The intention here is to talk more about the context in which the treaty exists as a film, rather than do a comparative of the historical events versus the dramatic portrayal. Previous videos on this channel have talked about the Easter Rising and the Irish War of Independence in the context of Neil Jordan's Michael Collins. Jordan's film does not really talk about the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which was a deliberate choice by Jordan, who thought the issue was too complex and would require its own movie to address properly. The entire period is reduced down to a few minutes of screen time and is made mostly about Collins and De Valera. The Irish War of Independence ended with a truce on the 11th of July 1921. Soon after, a delegation of Eamon De Valera, Arthur Griffith, Austin Stack, Robert Barton and Erskine Childers headed to London to meet with Prime Minister David Lloyd George. Michael Collins remained behind. Although Collins had wanted to go, De Valera did not want him present for fear that Collins, who was still a mysterious Irish Pimpernel figure, may be photographed. While De Valera brought with him a whole team, he and Lloyd George met alone. The meetings between the President and Prime Minister came to an end on July 21st with no agreement. De Valera knew from his meetings with Lloyd George that an independent republic was not a likely outcome. After a back-and-forth correspondence with Lloyd George, the Dáil agreed to enter a conference to ascertain how the association of Ireland with the community of nations known as the British Empire could best be reconciled with Irish national aspirations. On the issue of Northern Ireland, De Valera was willing to concede partition. He did not wish to coerce Ulster into an Irish republic by force, but to give the option of voting to opt in to the republic. Although De Valera maintained throughout his life that he got into politics with the aim of avoiding partition, and he maintained for decades that the ending of partition was his main goal, he was obviously quite prepared to use the issue as a bargaining chip to secure more freedom for the South in 1921. It should be mentioned that prior to the truce, the Government of Ireland Act 1920 had already come into force. This act created two states, Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. Elections were not held in the South, where all candidates were elected unopposed, and the 124 Sinn Féin candidates formed the second Dáil. The four other candidates who were elected, all Unionists, formed the Southern Irish House of Commons, which met only once, while in Northern Ireland the Ulster Unionists won a majority and formed the Northern Irish House of Commons. In one of the greatest ironies of Irish history, a Home Rule Parliament was inaugurated in the northeast of Ireland before a solution was reached for the rest of Ireland. For the British, the problem of Ulster had been solved, and it seemed reasonable that some solution could be found for the remainder of Ireland. After agreeing to meet with the British, the Dáil then had to choose its delegation to send to London. De Valera opted not to go this time. Having been newly appointed President of the Irish Republic in August 1921, he was now a symbol of the Republic, and thus should remain untouched. He was also aware that by not going, should things go wrong, he would be able to escape blame. He knew that those who went were likely to become scapegoats with the radicals if they compromised, and with the moderates if they did not. This time, Collins was asked to go, although he had to be convinced, feeling that the Michael Collins legend that had been cultivated in Britain and Ireland would be lost, and that his reputation would make him more valuable if kept at home. as the delegates would be able to seek more concessions on the pretext that they would have to appease the mysterious Collins. He was also the Dáil Minister for Finance, and so it did make sense that he would be asked to go, which he ultimately did. The Irish delegation, led by Arthur Griffith, arrived in London on the 11th of October 1921 with instructions from De Valera. They had full powers as plenipotentiaries to negotiate with the British, except that they couldn't make any decision without first referring back to Dublin. This instruction from De Valera was designed so that he would be able to have control over what happened in London without actually having to go himself. The delegates were sent to London to negotiate with the British, whose team included David Lloyd George, Lord Birkenhead and Winston Churchill. There was already a power imbalance between the two delegations, while at the same time De Valera wanted to have his cake and eat it too, by asking the delegates not to make any decisions without referring back to Dublin. Nowhere was there written down a clear, rounded statement of what the delegation was actually supposed to work towards and settle for. The conclusion that De Valera refused to be identified with any such statement is inescapable. The Irish delegation did not have proposals on what to do with Ulster. In the main, the constitutional relationship between Ireland and Britain dominated the talks. Dominion status, with an oath of allegiance, was what was settled upon. De Valera's preferred plan had been external association. However, the delegation had gone to London with no full understanding of what that actually was. External association was De Valera's plan to get out of the straitjacket of the Republic. His proposal was that Ireland be associated with, but not a member of the British Commonwealth. To explain what external association was to Arthur Griffith, the man who would lead his negotiations, De Valera drew him a little graph and said, "This is how I win." He did not win. None of De Valera's plans came to fruition, however. The Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed on December 6, 1921, and without his consultation.
You published the terms without my agreement!
The treaty allowed for the creation of an Irish state as an independent dominion of the British Empire. Northern Ireland's government was afforded the ability to opt in or out, and if they opted out, a boundary commission was to decide what the border between the two Irelands should be. Both supporters and opponents of the Anglo-Irish Treaty in Ireland had faith that the Commission would be a path to Irish unity. It was seen, as Alvin Jackson put it, as a merely transitory evil. The Dáil voted on the treaty in January 1922 and narrowly approved of it. It is somewhat symbolic that the future of Northern Ireland occupied only 9 of the 338 paragraphs of the records of the treaty debates in December 1921 and January 1922. It would not be until partition was in place that its effects would become apparent. The fallout from the Anglo-Irish Treaty led to a split in the Sinn Féin party and a civil war, following which the pro-treaty side would morph first into Cumann na Gael and then into Fine Gael. The anti-treaty Sinn Féin would further split and create Fianna Fáil. The Boundary Commission failed to transfer any of Northern Ireland to the Free State. Northern Ireland's borders remained as they were. Unionists, effectively the ruling class of a one-party state, one which introduced restrictive controls over the nationalist population. From 1964, a non-violent Catholic civil rights movement developed with the aim of ending this discrimination. In 1966, Unionists countered the civil rights movement by creating their own groups, including paramilitary groups like the Ulster Volunteer Force. In August 1969, clashes in Derry, which became known as the Battle of the Bogside, escalated into further protests across Northern Ireland, with Catholics fleeing to the Republic and the British Army being deployed in what became the longest continuous military deployment in Great Britain's history. During the 1960s, the IRA had given up violence, but a split in the organisation in 1969 led to the formation of the Provisional IRA. This group would go on to become the dominant IRA faction of this period. Originally formed to defend Catholics from attack, the PIRA would eventually take up a more offensive position. This period of conflict between the 1960s and 1998 is known as the Troubles. By 1991, the conflict had been going on for over 20 years. Coverage of Northern Ireland was censored in both the Republic of Ireland and Great Britain, either by law, self-censorship out of fear of government admonishment, or both. In the Republic of Ireland, there was censorship of broadcast media, there was sympathy, and there was also fear, as well as a disconnect from the realities of Northern Ireland for much of the population. The average person on the street during this period of unemployment and emigration being more concerned with their own daily life than that of someone in Belfast or Derry. Until the 1970s, nobody in public life in the Republic of Ireland argued that partition was justified. It was routinely denounced, both as a crime against the nation's territorial integrity and our people in the 6 counties. Sympathy with Northern Catholics and hostility to Ulster Unionists was a given. Emotionally and politically, the South claimed to want a united Ireland. Yet faced with the reality of war, the Republic seemed to recoil. The PIRA often inspired fear and horror. Republican violence carried with it more weight because the very idea of the IRA carried more cultural resonance to people in the South. Nobody in the Republic was nostalgic for or had a grandparent who was in the old UVF. Yet there still existed more popular acceptance of the old IRA and the old Sinn Féin, who were perceived as having had a democratic mandate and had turned from violence to constitutional democracy. In 1991, the Irish Independent found that 65% of people expressed pride in the Easter Rising of 1916. 58% believed the insurgents of 1916 had been right to take up arms against Britain, while 66% of people believed those who led the Rising of 1916 would oppose the modern IRA. In Britain, unless you were actively engaged in trying to learn about the conflict, by and large, you depended on the media. Children across the water were rarely taught why many had to leave Ireland because of an engineered famine by Britain that starved 1 million Irish people, or why Ireland rebelled against Britain during the First World War one Easter in 1916, or why 14 Irish people in Derry were killed by British soldiers on Bloody Sunday. Okay, so we've got that brief overview of Irish history out of the way. I think it's time that you and I watched a video. The treaty is a made-for-television docudrama first broadcast in the Republic of Ireland in December 1991 and then in the UK in January 1992. It starred an ex-secondary school teacher named Brendan Gleeson in his first major leading role, playing Michael Collins.
I am the only unknown quantity you have. You put my clogs under that table in Downing Street, and they will see what clay my feet are made of.
Future Oscar-winning screenwriter and creator of Downton Abbey, Julian Fellowes, who does an impression of Winston Churchill, worthy of a slot on GB News.
Then I will not only coerce them, I will beat them into the ground.
And Irish theatre, TV and film legend Bosco Hogan, who, with his smooth vocal stylings, plays Erskine Childers, the secretary to the Irish negotiation team.
We must stand on the rock of an independent, united republic. This whole approach is a trap.
The treaty was a co-production of RTE, the Irish state broadcaster, and Thames Television, the London regional franchise of British commercial broadcaster ITV, with additional funding from Australia's ABC Television and Merlin Films, the production company of English director and long-time Irish resident John Borman. Thames Television controller of factual programmes, Roger Bolton, conceived the programme as a means of marking the 70th anniversary of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. The film was targeted at a popular audience, as there existed in England a widespread ignorance of the origins of the issues in Northern Ireland, while for RTE it represented an opportunity for a much-needed reinterpretation of 70 years of Irish history. The UK's media, prior to the outbreak of conflict, kept largely silent on the subject of Northern Ireland, while from the 1970s, broadcast media outlets self-censored. Censorship of broadcast media was also widely supported by print media. The risks in attempting to inform the British audience on Northern Ireland was something Roger Bolton knew about all too well. Since partition, British media coverage in Northern Ireland had oscillated between media silence, compliance and resistance, in the interests of both the British government in Westminster and the Northern Irish government in Stormont. It was only with the civil rights movement and the violence of the Royal Ulster Constabulary in the 1960s that Northern Ireland began to garner wider coverage. In the early 1970s, with the introduction of internment by the British government, and British newspapers questioning whether television broadcasts of the British Army in Ireland were bad PR for the Army, broadcasters began to self-censor. The BBC refused to broadcast interviews with released internees, while news items which questioned the British Army's role in Northern Ireland were scrapped. The Independent Television Authority also began censoring programmes. In 1971, an episode of World in Action was banned sight unseen, due to it containing footage from the Sinn Féin annual conference. In response to pressure from newspapers, right-wing commentators and the government, the BBC developed the reference upward system, whereby journalists seeking to make programmes about Ireland had to refer to management for guidance. Essentially, programme makers had to obtain approval at all stages of production for their programmes. The BBC News Guide from 1972 on advised news staff sent to Northern Ireland work through the Controller Northern Ireland and News Editor Northern Ireland. They must be consulted. No news agency report from Northern Ireland should be used without checking with Belfast newsroom first. The IRA must not be interviewed without prior authority from ENCA, Editor of News and Current Affairs. There can be no question of doing the interview first and seeking permission for broadcast afterwards. Also keep in mind, this was very much still the era of analog television. There was no internet, no 24-hour news broadcasting. There were only BBC One, BBC Two, ITV and Channel 4, while in Ireland all you had was RTE, although if you had an aerial, in some places you could get the UK stations as well. Choices were therefore limited, as were avenues for obtaining information, and censorship on Northern Ireland was quite extensive. Between 1970 and 1989, a total of 76 TV programmes on Northern Ireland, documentaries, plays and even church services were either banned, refashioned, cut or postponed because of either internal or external pressure. That was an average of 1 every 3 months. For example, in 1983, the video for Invisible Sun by the Police was censored because it featured a collage of Ulster street scenes, incorporating urchins, graffiti, Saracens and soldiers. In 1985, Christmas Eve Mass from the Mater Hospital Belfast was replaced with a previously recorded programme for no apparent reason. And in 1990, the On Higher Ground episode of Star Trek The Next Generation was banned by the BBC. The episode centred around a terrorist organisation, and during the course of the programme, Lieutenant Commander Data noted that terrorism can be an effective way to promote political change. In doing so, he cited the Irish unification of 2024 as an example. The episode did not air in the UK until 2007. It has also never aired on RTE in the Republic of Ireland. In September 1979, Panorama, a weekly BBC current affairs show, planned a programme on the history of the Provisional IRA. The planned broadcast would feature interviews from senior Republicans, all of which had been cleared with the RUC, the British Army and the Northern Ireland office. On the 17th of October, a team from Panorama filmed an IRA checkpoint in Carrickmore, County Tyrone. This IRA operation occurred 11 miles from an army base and 6 miles from an RUC barracks, and without the knowledge of either the RUC or the Army, in an area which was usually intensively patrolled and surveyed. Journalist Mary Holland, speaking at the time, said of the incident, "It undermines much of the received wisdom about the current security arrangements in Northern Ireland, that Army surveillance techniques are more efficient than ever, that the border is of crucial importance to the IRA, and that their activities get little support from the local community." Upon learning of the incident, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher went scatty. The producers of the programme were accused of breaking the rules around filming in Ireland. The team from Panorama, however, claimed they had not broken any of the rules and followed correct procedure. Panorama, it was claimed, had allowed itself to be used as IRA propaganda. According to the Daily Express, it was as if during the Second World War, a BBC crew had gone to film the Nazis Nazis occupying the Channel Islands. The Sun newspaper wrote, "Witnesses said all roads out of Carrickmore were blocked by volunteers in a propaganda exercise. They brought out an arsenal of weapons to display before the cameras. These included 2 M60 machine guns, an RPG-7 rocket launcher, and Armalite rifles." Reports said that the men took up defensive positions in the village, while a main body of gunmen drilled in the streets. It was claimed that the rebels had control of Carrickmore for more than 3 hours in broad daylight, and only pulled out after the Panorama film crew said they had enough film. Scotland Yard launched an inquiry on the 9th of November under the Prevention of Terrorism Act, accusing those involved in the programme of failing to pass on to the authorities information which might have been used to capture terrorists. Under pressure from both the press and government, the BBC apologised. It also launched its own inquiry into whether Panorama had broken any rules. It was decided that there had been no collusion between the IRA and Panorama, but that the Northern Ireland controller had not been informed. The BBC then sacked the editor of Panorama, Roger Bolton, and he himself was accused of treachery and treason in the press. Bolton was sacked for not informing the BBC controller in Northern Ireland personally about the programme, although senior management in BBC Northern Ireland were aware of the project. Following the threat of a strike from the National Union of Journalists, Roger Bolton was reinstated. Carrickmore was the first of Thatcher's clashes with public broadcasters, and she was not a big fan of them in the first place. Her government was supported by Rupert Murdoch's newspapers, which were vocally in favour of government should television do anything to offend the Prime Minister. Now keep in mind, the Carrickmore Incident was about 15 minutes of film that was never shown. This is the kind of pressure that makes programmers nervous. Journalist Mary Holland wrote in 1981 that for every programme that gets banned, there are about 20 that don't get made. A BBC radio editor compared the circumstances to dealing with ectoplasm. Nobody is entirely to blame, but the end result of balancing acts and concerned editing is effectively censorship. Fear of political backlash and the reference upwards system created a subtle form of censorship in broadcast media in Britain on issues related to Northern Ireland. However, this would not be the last time that Roger Bolton was involved with a programme that ran afoul of the British government. On the 6th of March 1988, 3 unarmed members of the Provisional IRA were shot dead by the SAS at a petrol station in Gibraltar. Following the incident, various media outlets told of a gun battle with the police and the diffusion of a £500 bomb by military experts. British daily papers even reported on the type of bomb and how it was diffused. Journalists reacting to the news story on a Sunday evening simply repeated the press release from the Ministry of Defence. The release spoke of a suspect car bomb, a phrase which simply means a car which, for whatever reason, is thought to contain a bomb. But this subtle use of language was ignored by reporters. The size of the bomb, too, was mere speculation. Thames TV's This Week programme planned an episode called Death on the Rock, which explored the shootings and suggested that the killings had been unlawful. The programme's makers asserted that the 3 people killed were unarmed and that there had been no car bomb. The IBA were asked to delay its air date until after there had been an inquest into the events in Gibraltar. They refused, and the programme was broadcast on the 5th of May 1988. Roger Bolton was the editor on This Week, and as more information came out about the shooting in Gibraltar, he began to suspect something wasn't right. First, there had been a statement from the Foreign Secretary to say that there was no bomb, followed by press reports in the Sunday Telegraph and Sunday Times that claimed the terrorists were planning to detonate a remote-controlled bomb. These contradictory statements raised more questions than they answered. Something else nagged in the back of my mind. I knew that in Northern Ireland, when the security forces thought there was a bomb in a car, they evacuated the area immediately. This had not been done in Gibraltar, and indeed, there seemed to have been a wait of around at least 2 minutes after the shots before the car was searched. Death on the Rock was heavily criticised by the press and political establishment. The programme, its critics said, was trial by television. Death on the Rock is believed to be responsible for Thames TV losing its broadcasting licence in 1991. while in 1995 the killings were ruled to have been in violation of the European Convention on Human Rights. As we have seen, Roger Bolton had a career history of trying to provide coverage of Northern Ireland that ran contrary to the narrative of the British government. The controversies around Death on the Rock came only a few months before the introduction of the most stringent control of broadcast media in Britain since the Second World War.
You wanted some clarification on the Sinn Féin view?
In Britain, the troubles in Northern Ireland, alongside critical coverage of the Falklands War and the miners' strikes of the early to mid-80s, had increased tensions between the government and the media. This came alongside the rise of provisional Sinn Féin. The party were performing well in elections, particularly as a result of the hunger strikes of 1981. The idea that there could be popular support for Sinn Féin or the IRA among people in Northern Ireland was not something that the British government wished to see acknowledged. In the Northern Ireland elections of 1982, Sinn Féin won 35% of the nationalist vote. In 1983, Gerry Adams was elected MP for West Belfast, and the party got 43% of the nationalist vote. Official British policy was that the IRA were terrorists and criminals, with no political motivations. Paramilitary groups were depicted as mafia-like groups whose influence came only by the way of threat. The image was not wholly undeserved, and like all good propaganda, there was some truth in the accusation. No one ever knowingly voted for the mafia, however, so Sinn Féin's performances in 1982 and 83 exposed a serious credibility gap in government policy, and something fundamentally amiss with media coverage. It then became a question as to whether or not to engage with Sinn Féin, or whether doing so would encourage terrorists. Soon after Gerry Adams' election, the Northern Irish Secretary ruled out talking with Sinn Féin so long as they were committed to violence. This was the view of the governments of Britain and the Republic of Ireland. It meant not just ignoring the political party of Sinn Féin and criticising anyone who engaged with them, but also ignoring their voters. The approach came under the theory that terrorism thrived from the oxygen of publicity, a phrase taken from a speech made by Margaret Thatcher to the American Bar Association in July 1985. During the crisis, US outlets had aired interviews and press releases from the hijackers. Mrs. Thatcher in her speech affirmed that we in Britain will not accede to the terrorists' demands, and that while she opposed censorship, she just wanted the media to agree among themselves a voluntary code of conduct, a code under which they would not say or show anything which could assist the terrorists' morale or their cause. In other words, we're not going to censor you, but we're going to strongly encourage you not to cover the stories that we, the government, don't want you to. As we have already noted, censorship on matters relating to Northern Ireland had already existed. Journalists were already self-censoring out of fear of any political backlash. More often than not, journalists stuck to what they knew would be tolerated. From the 1970s, when censorship began in earnest, they more often than not affected programs relating to the IRA, republicanism, nationalism, or controversies around the police and army. The censorship graph shows a peak in 1971 and 72 following the failure of internment, the growth of the IRA, Bloody Sunday, and the allegations of British Army/RUC torture. Then it falls off. It peaked again in 1977 to 79, when controversy flared over the allegations of police brutality in places like Castlereagh Interrogation Centre, and when the IRA was beginning to rebuild after the setbacks inflicted by the policy of criminalisation. Not all the affected programmes in either period dealt with these subjects, but these do appear to have been times when an atmosphere conducive to censorship flourished. Following the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985, which gave the Republic of Ireland an advisory role in Northern Ireland, there was another wave of censorship. 23% of all programmes censored between 1970 and 1988 were made in the period following the Anglo-Irish Agreement. And it was in line with the Anglo-Irish Agreement that on the 19th of October 1988, Britain's Home Secretary Douglas Hurd introduced a ban on broadcasting direct statements from both Republican and Loyalist groups or their supporters. The ban came about following a succession of IRA bombings in 1988. Margaret Thatcher's initial desire had been to reintroduce internment. Instead, the voice ban was brought in under the BBC licence and the 1981 Broadcasting Act. Sinn Féin and the Provisional IRA were the main target. Sinn Féin and the Provisional IRA were the main target. Although the voluntary censorship that already existed meant interviews with Republican groups were already a rarity. According to Labour leader Roy Hattersley, in all of 1988, Sinn Féin had received 3 minutes and 59 seconds of television coverage on ITV. The wording of the voice ban was vague, and it was left up to different broadcasters as to how they would interpret it. The BBC, for example, took it to mean no reporting, no quoting organisations or its supporters, and no covering court reports if the story related to a banned group. Nor would they broadcast newspaper quotes from either the IRA or someone speaking in support of the IRA, while Channel 4 took the ban to include works of fiction as well as current affairs. Not only that, but the ban, in their view, was deemed retrospective. As such, Channel 4 agreed to censor much of 20th century history. The song The Birmingham Six by the Pogues was censored as a result of the broadcast ban.
So we were alleging that some people who were convicted in British courts were innocent, and we were also, they said that we alleged that people might have been beaten up or, given forced confessions. That is their statement from the IBA. That's not our statement, that's from the IBA.
And that we were alleging that Irish people could be disadvantaged in British courts.
When reporting on the National Union of Journalists' case against the ban, ITN News showed a still photo and read out the words instead of playing the song.
The most well-known element of the broadcast ban was that it led to the airing of dubbed interviews with members of groups whose voices were now banned. For example, the actor Stephen Ray on a few occasions provided the voice for Sinn Féin President Gerry Adams.
Mr. Major, as he should be doing anyway, wants to commence discussions with me or people who represent the party which I lead, we will start that immediately.
While it can sometimes seem quite silly, this was a serious act of censorship undertaken by the British government, which had contributed to an environment where it was nearly impossible to present balanced reporting on Northern Ireland. But what is most important for our purposes is that the broadcast ban brought the UK in line with the Republic of Ireland's already existing censorship.
See 2 letters, SF and U2. Is that a girl's name or does that stand for Sinn Féin? Because if it does, I say no more!
Radio Telefís Éireann, Ireland's national broadcaster, was established under the 1960 Broadcasting Act. RTE was to present news in an objective and impartial manner without any expression of the authorities' views. It was restricted by legalities such as libel laws and state secrets, just as newspapers were. In addition, however, Section 31 of the Broadcasting Act stated, "The Minister may direct the authority in writing to refrain from broadcasting any particular matter or matter of any particular class, and the authority shall comply with the direction." The authority here means the RTE Board of Directors, while the Minister in question was the Minister for Posts and Telegraphs, now the Minister for Communications. In theory, Section 31 meant that the Minister could ban anything they wanted from appearing on RTE, not that they ever would. As according to then Minister Michael Hilliard, Section 31 will enable me to direct the authority to refrain from broadcasting any particular matter or class of matter. I should make it clear that this section is not intended to provide the Minister with a general power of censorship, as the whole approach has been to place the minimum of restrictions on the authority in the matter of programmes. However, the service to be provided will be a national one, and in the final analysis, there must be reserved to the government some means of ultimate control over broadcasts which might be inimical to the national interest. The power is necessary for use in the most exceptional cases, and I am sure that no minister would try to abuse it. Despite the Act insisting that RTE should remain impartial, Irish governments often felt that the national broadcaster should in fact act in support of the Irish government. Sean Lamass, Taoiseach at the time RTE was established, rejected the notion that RTE should be either generally, or in regard to its current affairs programmes, completely independent of government supervision, and instead viewed the broadcaster as an instrument of public policy. There was a constant tension between RTE and the government. According to Betty Purcell, a producer at RTE from 1979 till 2012, the very birth of Irish current affairs television was marred by a series of battles for autonomy from the government. The then Minister for Agriculture, Charles Haughey, complained about his treatment in the news and had an item changed in subsequent bulletins. A news programme to be filmed in North Vietnam was cancelled after government intervention. Similarly, intervention stopped a 7 days film crew from going to Biafra in 1968. These were the public involvements. Behind the scenes, there was constant pressure on programme makers to go easy on ministers, to play down controversies, and to avoid subjecting the government to the full rigours of a debate format. Sometimes the government won, at other times the programmers did, but these were the battles. The decisive one was to come on a specific issue. In August 1969, Taoiseach Jack Lynch asked the media to refrain from publicising statements by the IRA and using language that may romanticise the group. It was also asked that the IRA be simply referred to as an illegal organisation. In 1970, an order was issued under Section 31 that prevented RTE from broadcasting anything that could be calculated to promote the aims or activities of an organisation which engages in, promotes, engages, or advocates the attaining of any particular objectives by violent means, which RTE took to mean as they could not speak to members of the provisional or official IRA, but they could report on them and discuss their activities, so long as it was done carefully. On the 19th of November 1972, IRA Chief of Staff Sean McSteofan was arrested leaving the home of RTE journalist Kevin O'Kelly. McSteofan had been interviewed by O'Kelly for the RTE radio programme This Week. The interview was not to be aired. Instead, O'Kelly planned on reading a transcript. On the 24th of November, as a direct result of the interview, the entire RTE board was sacked by the Minister Jerry Collins. The next day, O'Kelly was arrested. He was sentenced to 3 months in prison for refusing to identify McSteofan as the man he interviewed, although this was later reduced to a £250 fine. The reason given for sacking the entire RTE board by the minister was that he did not want RTE used as an IRA recruitment tool. He then issued new guidelines under Section 31 banning the official IRA and provisional IRA, and strict permission was now needed to speak with representatives of either provisional or official Sinn Féin. In February 1973, Fianna Fáil's 16 years in government came to an end, and they were replaced by a Fine Gael and Labour coalition, meaning that there was a new Minister for Posts and Telegraphs in town, a man they called the Cruiser. Dr. Donal, Conor, David, Dermot, Donagh, Cruz O'Brien was a politician, writer and diplomat. Prior to the outbreak of the Troubles, Cruz O'Brien was an internationally known left-wing writer. He had once welcomed Gretchen and Rudi Dutschke, socialists and leaders of the German students' movements, to his home in Howth in 1968. A year earlier, at a symposium in 1967 alongside Noam Chomsky and Hannah Arendt, he responded to Arendt's opposition to the Viet Cong terror by saying, "I think there is a distinction between the use of terror by oppressed peoples against the oppressors and their servants, in comparison with the use of terror by the oppressors in the interest of further oppression. I think there is a qualitative distinction there which we have the right to make." O'Brien was elected a Labour TD in 1969. He opposed the Fianna Fáil government's plans to introduce internment in the Republic, was an opponent of partition, and a vocal critic of Section 31. I do not think that the Irish public would like to see RTE brought into line and being made the object of what the National Socialists used to call Gestaltung, coordination, being brought into line with the party, and being made transmission systems for the party's ideology the party's personnel, and so on. In any modern democracy, the autonomy of radio and television is as vital as the freedom of the press and of Parliament. Now, Cruiser's politics shifted a bit in the 70s, and it would take an entire video to unpack everything about that man. But suffice to say, he wasn't a fan of the Provisional IRA or Sinn Féin. He thought that literature and ballads were to blame for Republican violence, and that the killing strain of republicanism came through the mother. Cruiser was also fine with police brutality as long as it got results. In his memoirs, he recounted learning of how Garda Special Branch had beaten a man in order to extract the whereabouts of kidnapped Dutch businessman Tida Herreman. Police brutality, in his own words, didn't worry him. He also kept a file of letters on Irish unity that were sent to the Irish Press newspaper, and while Minister for Posts and Telegraphs, he called a gathering of Irish journalists provost stooges. He also didn't like that in some Irish homes you could get British TV, just in case someone might see the Ra. Although, as we've mentioned, that probably wasn't really likely to happen. Incidentally, Christopher Hitchens was a big fan of Conor Cruise O'Brien, and they had a lot in common. For one, they were both verbose lefties who, in response to terrorism, turned into verbose right-wing conservatives. Conor Cruise O'Brien's most significant alterations to Section 31 came in 1976, after Garda Michael Clerkin was killed by a Provisional IRA bomb. As part of their coverage, RTE interviewed a Provisional IRA spokesperson. In response, O'Brien issued an order under Section 31, which stated, "Radio Telefís Éireann is hereby directed to refrain from broadcasting any matter which is an interview or report of an interview with a spokesman or with spokesmen for any one or more of the following organisations, namely, the organisation styling itself the Irish Republican Army, also IRA, and Óglacht na hÉireann, the organisation styling itself Provisional Sinn Féin. Any organisation which in Northern Ireland is a proscribed organisation within the meaning of Section 28 of the Act of the British Parliament entitled the Northern Ireland Emergency Provisions Act 1973. In his memoir, he stated that this change was specifically targeted at the IRA, as it was something that the previous Fianna Fáil government would have been reluctant to do, due to Fianna Fáil styling themselves as the Republican Party, and their members having some sentimental ties to Sinn Féin. He also defended his overall changes to Section 31 during his time as minister. In drafting the legislation, the principle on which I worked was one of limited liberalisation. It would be liberal in that it would remove from the hands of the minister the power of removing the authority, the power which had been misused by Collins, and invest this in the Oireachtas, Parliament alone, Dáil and Senate. It would not be liberalised in that the minister would retain the power to order by directive the provision of broadcasts on behalf of subversive organisations such as the IRA. The principle involved there was the protection of the security of the democratic state against the broadcasting of subversive propaganda by organisations whose function was to work under the orders of the leadership of a private army for revolutionary purposes. The effects of Conor Cruise O'Brien's changes to Section 31 meant that organisations now banned from RTE included Sinn Féin, the IRA, the UDA, and any organisation illegal in Northern Ireland. This was at a time when the Constitution of the Republic of Ireland did not recognise the Northern Irish state, yet here the government was using Northern Irish law to justify censorship. Unlike the British Broadcasting ban of 1988, Section 31 made it very clear who was banned. In practice, it meant that people who were undeniably members of Sinn Féin, like Gerry Adams or Martin McGuinness, were banned, alongside supporters of Sinn Féin and suspected members of Sinn Féin.
Joined now, my friends, by the most controversial man in this country.
Conor Cruise O'Brien lost his seat in 1977, but his impact was long-lasting. To quote journalist Mary Holland, Conor Cruise O'Brien created an atmosphere where self-censorship was raised to the level of an art, and caution lay like a thick cloud over everything. This impacted RTE in a number of ways. For example, RTE's reporters covering the elections in West Belfast were unable to interview Gerry Adams and instead had to interview the defeated candidate John Hendren of the centre-left SDLP. Some impacts were less obvious than others. In the 1980s, the group Concerned Parents Against Drugs was formed in response to Dublin's heroin epidemic. Many of its members were working class and also members of Sinn Féin. RTE journalists had to ask prospective interviewees if they were members of Sinn Féin before interviewing them. The group and the issue received less coverage from RTE as a direct result of Section 31. In 1982, Eileen Flynn, a teacher from County Wexford, became pregnant as a result of a relationship with a married man, much to the disapproval of the nuns who ran the school where she worked. Flynn was then fired from her job. The story attracted news attention. However, the man in question was a member of Sinn Féin, and therefore Flynn had to be asked whether or not she was a party member too before she could be interviewed on coverage of her story. To quote Betty Purcell, who called Flynn in the hopes of getting her to consent to an interview, "I telephoned, rather gingerly, because I was aware that she was suspicious of media interest in her story. She was not inclined to do the interview. But I was convincing her, I felt. I took a deep breath and asked the question. There was silence. And then she said, 'Look, I'd rather not talk to the radio.' That was that. The pros and cons of her case were debated by all and sundry, but our chance of getting the story from the principal herself had been jeopardized by censorship relating to issues totally removed from those of sexual morality. A radio segment discussing homosexuality and AIDS with the group Gay Health Action and the then Minister for Health was cut short when it was revealed the main spokesperson for the group was in Sinn Féin. Ireland has this daily radio call-in show called Liveline. It's sort of like Reddit but for old people. And in November 1987, the show ran a segment on gardening. A caller rang in with a question about making wine from mushrooms. After asking his question, he mentioned he was a member of Sinn Féin, prompting the host Marion Finucane to immediately cut the caller off. The caller was in fact Marcus Free, a media studies student who rang in with the express intention of highlighting censorship under Section 31. Just a fun little example of how Section 31 affected broadcasting in Ireland. RTE's coverage was not just hampered by pressure from the government. There were also people working inside RTE who were opposed to the IRA and Sinn Féin, including a group aligned to the Workers Party. When Sinn Féin split in 1970, those who did not go on to form Provisional Sinn Féin reorganised as Official Sinn Féin. The party was later renamed as the Workers' Party. The party was opposed to physical force republicanism and instead embraced a Marxist-Leninist view of Irish republicanism, seeing the issues in Northern Ireland not as sectarian but as the result of a class struggle. The Workers' Party group within RTE was called the Ned Stapleton Come On being the Irish word for association. A leading figure in this association was the RTE producer and former Twitter user Owen Harris. While those associated with the Come On deny they had any real influence, according to journalist Vincent Brown, Harris and the Ned Stapleton Come On attempted and succeeded in slanting RTE current affairs programmers on radio and television through the judicious placement of its members and associates in key roles. In doing so, they gravely damaged the credibility of RTE's current affairs output, especially in relation to northern coverage, on which it sought to exclude any voice that it considered sympathetic to Provisional Sinn Féin. Many Workers' Party members within RTE, including Owen Harris, the future writer on the TV show Sharp, were supporters of Section 31. People associated with or sympathetic to the Workers' Party in RTE were involved with RTE's current affairs flagship programme Today Tonight, as well as the station's flagship talk show, The Late Late Show. While working as a reporter on Today Tonight, future President of Ireland Mary McAleese was subject to criticism from the Workers' Party because of her northern nationalist background. Harris, co-creator of the Big Bow Wow, would later call McAleese a typical whinging northern grievance monger. The Workers' Party's influence over RTE current affairs, Section 31, and the desires of the political establishment dovetailed quite nicely. The conservative leaderships of the Irish political establishment were happy to see the Republican viewpoint excluded, even if that meant the eventual, short-lived emergence of the Workers Party. The attempt by the Workers Party to control media coverage of the North was largely successful because it was in tune with a conservative fear of the consequence of permitting exposure of nationalist experience in the North. That conservative attitude continued to affect coverage long after the demise of Section 31 in January 1994 and the Workers' Party influence. It was also not confined to RTE. On one hand, you had British desires to paint the conflict in a light which makes Britain a neutral player in Northern Ireland, while in the Republic of Ireland, you saw people pulling back from the irredentism that had long defined the attitudes of the state, while also exclaiming that the old Sinn Féin and the old IRA were good actually, but this one, this new one, it's bad. It's bad because they use the crime guns. The way the state marked the 75th anniversary of the Easter Rising demonstrates this change in attitude.
Commemoration, not celebration, is the official word being used to mark the 75th anniversary of the 1916 Rising. In 1966, the 50th anniversary of the Rising was a fanfare of glory and celebration. 25 years later, there appears to be a shift in emphasis away from the military struggle, concentrating instead on the historical importance of 1916 in laying the foundation stone of the Irish Republic.
In 1991, the 75th anniversary commemoration was 15 minutes long. The event was attended by 5 of the then 6 remaining veterans of the Rising. The 6th refused to attend in protest at what they felt was the state's betrayal of the ideals of 1916. The then Taoiseach Charles Haughey launched a stamp marking Dublin as European City of Culture, and neither Fine Gael leader John Bruton nor any of his front bench attended. Indeed, Fine Gael preferred to draw attention to the work of constitutional nationalists rather than violent insurrection. While there appears to have been, according to writer Declan Kibbard, a fear in RTE that glorification of the Easter rebels leads young people to join the IRA. RTE's Wednesday Report programme, for example, looked back critically at the 1966 programme Insurrection, a dramatisation of the Easter Rising. The mood was very much not for violence. So, how does this all tie back into the treaty?
That's all ballsology, chillers.
Roger Bolton believed that producing a film about the Anglo-Irish Treaty would provide historical context for contemporary political affairs. The choice to make the film a docudrama rather than a documentary arose out of the lack of archival footage or living people to interview. Despite being set prior to the outbreak of the Troubles, the film was still subject to broadcasting regulations which emphasised a need to stick to accepted versions of events, allowing very little room for re-examination or reinterpretation. The ITC broadcast code stated, "It is inevitable that the creative realization of some elements such as characterization, dialogue and atmosphere will induce a fictional dimension, but this should not be allowed to distort the known facts." Historians R.F. Foster, Tim Pat Coogan and Frank Pakenham, Lord Longford, acted as consultants for Brian Phelan's script. The makers of the film strove for balance and authenticity. It was shot in Ireland with Irish actors, taking place in the actual rooms that the real people portrayed in the film would have occupied. The fact the film was bringing history to life was also a key part of its marketing. Sinn Féin in direct talks at Downing Street with the British Prime Minister? Impossible. It actually happened 70 years ago. Tonight's drama brings the people and issues of that turbulent time to life. It is a straightforward dramatisation of the events surrounding the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, although it does not touch upon Ulster Unionism, and James Craig is simply a figure in the background who is spoken about but never seen. It also has a bias towards Michael Collins, as it was Brian Phelan's wish in writing the script to make a case for Michael Collins. This fits in well with the growth of interest in Collins that had sprung up in the previous decade, out of which came Tim Pat Coogan's biography, which was used as source material. The treaty came out at a time not only of censorship around Irish issues in Britain, but one where the British government was openly stating their refusal to talk to terrorists. And here it shows David Lloyd George and Winston Churchill doing exactly that. while Michael Collins is the defender of electoral democracy and a reluctant revolutionary, making the pragmatic choice to give up violence in the name of peace. Phelan's screenplay emphasises this portrayal of Collins and makes a point of ending on Collins's exchange with Lord Birkenhead.
I may have just signed my political death warrant.
I have signed my actual death warrant.
Collins is the hero of the film. He's the character the audience spends the most time with. He's funny, he's charming, he likes to wrestle with the boys. He hangs out with Lady Lavery, wife of painter John Lavery, with whom there were rumours he had an affair. The audience, both British and Irish, are made to empathise with him. And unlike in Neil Jordan's film, there is considerably less violence, which is arguably more acceptable for the time the film was made. The film likely achieves what Bolton had wanted. A viewer will come away with it with a much greater understanding of the tensions and the drama that went into the Anglo-Irish Treaty negotiations. That said, the film does feel occasionally very stagey. It's clearly got a very low budget. I mean, it is a 1991 made-for-television film. In many ways, it is a product of its time and of television. A few years later, Neil Jordan would make the much better remembered, but arguably more flawed Michael Collins. By that time, Section 31 and the broadcast ban were gone. Jordan's film still courted criticism for being violent and potentially damaging the peace process. Critics of Jordan's film included the historian R.F. Foster, who consulted on the treaty, and Owen Harris, who himself is the author of an unproduced Michael Collins screenplay. The point of this video is to show that films are a product of their context, that current moods can explain what gets celebrated and what doesn't, that political sensibilities can shape what we see, and this doesn't even get into the fact that the writing of history itself can be influenced by public mood. Roger Bolton and others like him are worth remembering for their continued work to inform the general public on Northern Ireland and British people on Irish history. If you want to watch the treaty, well, I literally bought the last DVD on eBay while I was writing the script, so unless there's more, well, good luck to you, really. Although, I'm pretty sure if you type the treaty 1991 Brendan Gleeson into the search bar of a certain website, I'm not saying which one, but it might look like the one we're all on right now. It's quite possible that you might come across a copy of this. Not that I'm encouraging that kind of thing, but what I am encouraging you to do is to like, share, comment, subscribe to this channel, to this very video in fact, because you like it, I assume. Yeah. Bye. Thanks for watching. Yes, that's what I meant to say.